Hello everyone, and welcome back to Snowbound Screams. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. Abandoned towns stand as monuments to forgotten dreams, their empty streets and decaying structures holding echoes of lives once lived. But sometimes, these echoes become more than mere memories. Sometimes, something remains in the hollowed-out spaces where communities once thrived. In this extended episode, we'll explore 8 accounts from those who have ventured into these abandoned places and encountered phenomena that defy explanation. These are not tales of haunted houses or restless spirits in the traditional sense. Rather, they are accounts of entire communities where something has remained, something that doesn't welcome visitors. These stories come from verified police reports, documented witness testimonies, and archived recordings. They span decades and cross the American landscape, from mining towns in the Appalachian Mountains to desert settlements in the Southwest. From abandoned fishing villages to forgotten factory towns. Each account follows a similar pattern. A curious visitor or researcher enters an abandoned community, expecting only decay and silence, but instead encounters something that suggests the town is not as empty as it appears. These encounters range from inexplicable sounds and movements to direct interactions with presences that should not exist. The witnesses we'll hear from are not paranormal investigators seeking thrills. They are historians, urban explorers, photographers, and in some cases, former residents returning to places they once called home. Their accounts share a common thread of quiet terror that comes from realizing you are not alone in a place that should be completely empty. Now, let us begin with our first story. In late October of 2017, documentary filmmaker Michael Chen arrived in Centralia, Pennsylvania. He had spent months researching the town's history, preparing to film a documentary about the community that had been gradually abandoned since a coal mine fire began burning beneath it in 1962. What he captured over the next 3 days would become one of the most disturbing pieces of footage in his 20-year career. Michael had set up his camera equipment on a tripod near the eastern edge of town, where a few crumbling structures still stood defiantly against time. The autumn air carried the distinctive scent of burning coal that permeated everything in Centralia, a constant reminder of the underground fire that had been burning for over 50 years. Steam rose from fissures in the ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that had drawn numerous photographers and curiosity seekers over the years. As Michael adjusted his camera settings, he noticed something unusual. The steam rising from the ground seemed to be forming patterns almost like words written in a language he couldn't understand. He dismissed it as a trick of the light and continued his work, documenting the buckled highway that had been the subject of so many photographs. The highway had cracked and buckled from the underground heat, creating a surreal landscape that spoke of nature's power to reclaim what humans had built. The first anomaly occurred at approximately 2:17 p.m., according to Michael's camera timestamps. As he was filming the abandoned St. Ignatius Catholic Church, whose cemetery had been relocated but whose building remained standing, he heard what sounded like church bells ringing. The sound was distant but clear, 8 distinct chimes that echoed through the empty streets. Michael knew this was impossible. The church had been abandoned since 1992, and its electrical system had been disconnected decades ago. He captured the audio on his professional recording equipment, which later analysis confirmed was unaltered. What followed was even more disturbing. As the bell sounds faded, Michael noticed movement inside the church through his camera's zoom lens. Figures appeared to be moving between the pews, dark silhouettes that seemed to materialize and dissipate like smoke. He counted at least 7 distinct forms, all appearing to participate in some kind of ritual or ceremony. Through his high-powered lens, he could see them bowing and rising in unison, though their features remained indistinct. Michael's training as a documentarian took over, and he continued filming despite the growing sense of unease. The temperature around him had dropped noticeably, and the steam rising from the ground seemed to intensify, swirling around his equipment in unnatural patterns. He later reported that the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur, far stronger than the normal coal scent he had grown accustomed to during his time in Centralia. At approximately 3:42 p.m., Michael's camera captured what would become the most compelling evidence of his encounter. As he panned across the church interior, one of the figures appeared to notice his presence. The silhouette turned slowly toward the window where Michael was filming, and for a brief moment, what he described as a face of absolute darkness seemed to look directly at him. The figure then raised what appeared to be an arm and pointed directly at Michael's position. This was the moment Michael decided to leave. As he hastily packed his equipment, he heard what sounded like footsteps approaching from inside the church, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to be coming directly toward the door. The sound was accompanied by a low humming that grew louder with each step. Michael didn't wait to see what would emerge. He grabbed his camera bag and tripod and ran back to his vehicle, leaving behind a light reflector he couldn't retrieve quickly enough. The Columbia County Sheriff's Department report filed the following day. Incident Report 17C-4421 notes that Deputy James Harrison met with Michael at a diner in nearby Ashland. Michael appeared genuinely frightened, his hands shaking as he showed the deputy his footage. The report states that Harrison observed multiple unexplained figures and movements in the video, but made no official determination about their nature. What makes Michael's account particularly compelling is the audio evidence. When audio analysts later examined his recordings, they discovered something extraordinary beneath the bell sounds and humming. When the audio was enhanced and filtered, faint voices could be heard speaking in what was identified by linguists as an Eastern European dialect, possibly Polish or Lithuanian. Centralia had been home to many immigrants from these regions who had worked in the mines. Even more disturbing, when the voices were translated, they appeared to be reciting what one expert identified as a ritual of protection specifically. A prayer asking for deliverance from something that walks beneath the earth. The prayer seemed to be directed not at a deity, but at whatever was causing the underground fire, suggesting that whatever remained in Centralia was not merely the ghosts of former residents, but something that had been drawn to the town by the fire itself. Michael returned to Centralia only once more, exactly 1 week later, accompanied by 2 colleagues. They found his missing light reflector exactly where he had left it. But it had been arranged in a perfect circle with 8 small stones placed at equal intervals around it. When they reviewed the footage from their second visit, they discovered that the church appeared completely empty, no figures, no movement, no sounds. However, the temperature readings they had taken were consistently 15 to 20 degrees lower than the surrounding area, and their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly when pointed toward the building. Michael Chen never completed his documentary about Centralia. Instead, he released the raw footage with minimal commentary, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. The footage has been analyzed by numerous experts, and while skeptics suggest pareidolia and equipment malfunctions could explain some phenomena, even the most skeptical viewers acknowledge that certain elements, particularly the synchronized movements of the figures and the translated ritual, defy conventional explanation. Today, Centralia continues its slow burn beneath the earth, with only a handful of stubborn residents remaining in the town. Those who live nearby report that strange occurrences have increased in recent years, particularly during the autumn months. Some locals refuse to travel near the abandoned church after dusk, claiming they've seen lights moving inside the building and heard what sounds like chanting carried on the wind. Michael Chen's encounter raises unsettling questions about what might remain in places where humans have fled. Perhaps some abandoned locations don't simply decay. Perhaps they transform into something else entirely, becoming vessels for phenomena that we don't yet understand. In Centralia, the underground fire that drove residents away may have created something new in the void they left behind, something that continues its rituals beneath the Pennsylvania sky, waiting for the day when the fires finally burn out. In the spring of 2019, history professor Dr. Eleanor Vance and 3 of her graduate students arrived in Cahaba, Alabama, to conduct archaeological surveys of what was once the state's first capital. Now a ghost town and archaeological site, Cahaba had once been a thriving community until its abandonment after the Civil War. The team expected to find historical artifacts and remnants of 19th century life. But what they discovered instead would challenge their understanding of the nature of abandoned places. The expedition began on a pleasant April morning, with the Alabama sun filtering through the cypress trees that lined the Cahaba River. Dr. Vance had secured special permits from the Alabama Historical Commission to conduct limited excavations in areas not typically open to the public. Her team graduate students, James Mitchell, Sarah Torres, and David Chen, set up their equipment near the site of the former St. Luke's Episcopal Church, where only a few crumbling columns remained standing. The first day proceeded normally, with the team carefully documenting and cataloging small artifacts, pottery shards, nails, and other remnants of daily life from the 1800s. The atmosphere was peaceful, with only the sounds of birds and the gentle flow of the nearby river disturbing the silence. As evening approached, the team packed up their equipment and made their way back to the campsite they had established on the outskirts of the archaeological site. It was during the second day that phenomena began to occur. James Mitchell was conducting a magnetic survey of an area believed to have been a residential block when his equipment began malfunctioning. The readings fluctuated wildly, creating patterns that made no geological sense. When he recalibrated the device, the readings returned to normal for approximately 15 minutes before beginning to fluctuate again in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. Dr. Vance examined the readings and noted that they seemed to form a spiral pattern, beginning at the center of the survey area and expanding outward in perfect mathematical precision. As a trained archaeologist, she knew that no natural phenomenon could create such specific magnetic readings. The team decided to mark the area and continue with their work, though all members later reported feeling an increasing sense of being watched as the day progressed. The most significant encounter occurred on the 3rd day of the expedition. Sarah Torres was photographing the remains of the Crocheron columns, all that remained of a mansion built in 1843, when she noticed something unusual in her viewfinder. Between 2 of the columns, a figure appeared, a woman in what appeared to be 19th century clothing, standing perfectly still and facing the river. At first, Sarah assumed it was a reenactor or another visitor to the site, though she knew the area was restricted to her team. When she lowered her camera to look directly at the spot, no one was there. Confused, she raised her camera again, and the figure reappeared in exactly the same position. This sequence repeated 3 times before Sarah called her colleagues over. What happened next was documented by all 4 members of the team. The figure remained visible only through cameras and other viewing devices. It could not be seen with the naked eye. When viewed through different cameras, it appeared consistently, always in the same position, always wearing the same clothing, Dr. Vance, who had extensive experience with optical illusions and camera artifacts, confirmed that the phenomenon could not be explained by equipment malfunction or environmental factors. As the team continued to observe the figure through their cameras, they noticed that it began to move very slowly, turning to face them directly. Through the camera lenses, they could see that the figure's face was featureless, smooth, and unmarked, as if worn away by time. The figure raised one arm and pointed toward the river, where the team then noticed something even more disturbing. The surface of the water, which had been calm moments before, began to stir, though there was no wind. Small waves formed in a circular pattern, creating what appeared to be a whirlpool approximately 20 feet in diameter. At the center of this disturbance, the water seemed to darken, becoming almost black despite the bright sunlight. David Chen, who was filming the encounter, captured what happened next. As the team watched through their cameras, figures began to emerge from the darkened water, first one, then three, then dozens. These figures moved differently from the one between the columns. They seemed to flow rather than walk, their forms indistinct and constantly shifting. They moved toward the riverbank, where they gathered in a silent crowd, all facing the archaeological team. Dr. Vance, maintaining her professional composure, instructed her students to document everything while slowly backing away from the river. The figures in the water remained motionless, watching them with their featureless faces. The figure between the columns lowered its arm and slowly faded from view, though it remained visible in the cameras for several minutes after disappearing to the naked eye. The team retreated to their campsite, where they spent a restless night. All members reported hearing what sounded like distant voices speaking in what they identified as a combination of English and what might have been Choctaw or another Native American language. The voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the river, growing louder as midnight approached. The following morning, the team discovered that several of their excavation sites had been disturbed. Tools and equipment had been moved and arranged in precise patterns, and artifacts that had been carefully cataloged and stored were now laid out in what appeared to be deliberate arrangements. Most disturbingly, in the center of each arrangement was a small, smooth stone, none of which could be matched to any stones found naturally in the area. Dr. Vance contacted the Alabama Historical Commission to report these occurrences, and the site director, Robert Franklin, visited the camp that afternoon. Franklin, who had overseen the archaeological site for 15 years, examined the arrangements and listened to the team's account. His official report, AHC 190422, notes that he found unexplained arrangements of artifacts and equipment, but makes no determination about their cause. What makes this encounter particularly significant is the historical context of Cahaba. The town had been built near the confluence of the Cahaba and Alabama rivers, an area that had been sacred to Native American tribes long before European settlement. Historical records indicate that the site had been abandoned by Native populations due to what their oral histories described as disturbances in the water phenomena that colonial accounts dismissed as superstition. Furthermore, during the Civil War, Cahaba had been the site of a prison camp where thousands of Union soldiers were held under horrific conditions. Many died from disease and exposure, with their bodies buried in mass graves near the river. Could the phenomena witnessed by Dr. Vance's team be related to these historical events? Or could they be connected to something even older, something that had caused the original native inhabitants to abandon the area centuries before? The team packed up their equipment and departed the following day, leaving behind only a report for the Alabama Historical Commission. All 4 members underwent psychological evaluation after returning to their university, with all being deemed mentally sound and credible witnesses. The photographs and video footage they captured have been analyzed by multiple experts, with no evidence of tampering or fabrication found. In the 2 years since this encounter, other visitors to Cahaba have reported similar phenomena. Photographers have captured images of figures that appear only in photographs, and visitors have reported hearing voices near the river, particularly at dawn and dusk. The Alabama Historical Commission has not officially acknowledged these occurrences, but has quietly increased security around the archaeological site after hours. Dr. Vance and her students have never returned to Cahaba, though they have published a paper about their findings in a peer-reviewed archaeological journal, carefully framing their account as unexplained environmental phenomena, rather than supernatural encounters. Still, in private conversations, Dr. Vance has acknowledged that what they experienced in those 4 days has fundamentally changed her understanding of abandoned places and what might remain in them long after humans have departed. Perhaps some locations retain echoes of everyone who has lived and died there, layer upon layer of memory and experience that somehow becomes visible under the right conditions. In Cahaba, where so much history, both tragic and peaceful, has unfolded, perhaps these layers have become thin enough to see through, allowing us glimpses of what remains when we are gone. In August of 2018, professional photographer Emma Rodriguez arrived in Bodie, California, intending to spend a week documenting the preserved ghost town for a book on abandoned American communities. Bodie, a former gold mining town that had once been home to nearly 10,000 people, now stood frozen in time, a state historic park maintained in a state of arrested decay, with buildings preserved but not restored. What Emma captured during her stay would become far more than architectural documentation. Emma had secured special permission from California State Parks to photograph inside several buildings normally closed to the public, including the old Methodist Church and the Masonic Lodge. She arrived on a Monday morning, checking in with park rangers before setting out with her equipment. The August heat was intense, with temperatures reaching 95 degrees by early afternoon, creating a shimmering effect above the dusty streets that made the town seem even more unreal. The first 2 days of Emma's visit proceeded normally. She photographed exterior shots in the early morning and late afternoon light, when the sun cast long shadows across the abandoned buildings. Inside the structures, she documented peeling wallpaper, rusted machinery, and personal items left behind when residents fled the town's declining fortunes. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of history, but nothing seemed unusual beyond the expected sense of a place frozen in time. The first anomaly occurred on Wednesday evening. Emma was photographing the interior of the old schoolhouse, where desks and blackboards remained as they had been when the last class was held in the 1930s. As she was setting up a shot of the teacher's desk, she heard what sounded like children's laughter coming from the playground outside. The sound was distant, but distinct, multiple voices playing what seemed to be a game of tag. Emma stepped outside to investigate, but the playground was empty, as was the entire town. Park rangers had locked the gates at 5 p.m., and she was the only person authorized to be in the park after hours. She returned to the schoolhouse, assuming the sound had been carried on the wind from nearby campsites, though she knew the nearest campground was several miles away. An hour later, as she was packing up her equipment, Emma heard the laughter again, this time from inside the schoolhouse itself. The sound seemed to be coming from the coat room at the back of the classroom. As she approached, she noticed that several of the coats hanging on the hooks were swaying gently, though there was no breeze in the sealed building. More disturbingly, small footprints had appeared in the dust on the floor, fresh prints that hadn't been there when she first entered the room. Emma documented the footprints with her camera, noting that they appeared to be made by children of various sizes. The prints led from the coat room to several desks before returning to the coat room and disappearing. When she examined the coats more closely, She discovered that one of them, a small wool coat with buttons shaped like animals, was warm to the touch, as if it had recently been worn. The following day, Emma mentioned these occurrences to Park Ranger Thomas Mitchell, who assured her that old buildings often produced strange sounds and that the footprints were likely from small animals that had found their way inside. Emma wasn't convinced, but continued with her work, though she kept her camera recording continuously as a precaution. Thursday night brought even more disturbing phenomena. Emma was photographing the interior of the old general store, where shelves still held rusted cans and boxes with labels from the early 20th century. As she was focusing on a display of medicine bottles, she heard what sounded like the store's bell ringing, followed by footsteps approaching from the back room. Emma froze, listening as the footsteps grew closer. She could hear what sounded like heavy boots walking across the wooden floor, accompanied by the jingle of spurs, a sound that would have been common in Bodie's mining days, but certainly not today. The footsteps stopped just behind her, though no one was visible when she turned around. What happened next was captured on Emma's camera, which she had left recording on a tripod across the room. As Emma stood with her back to the entrance of the store, items on the shelves began to move slightly. A can of peaches shifted position, a box of matches slid forward a few inches, and a glass jar containing what appeared to be pickles lifted slightly from the shelf before settling back into place. Emma slowly backed out of the store, not turning until she was outside. Once in the street, she looked back through the window and saw what appeared to be a tall figure wearing a cowboy hat, standing behind the counter. The figure was indistinct, almost transparent, but definitely visible. As Emma watched, it raised a hand in what appeared to be a greeting before fading from view. That night, Emma slept in her RV rather than in the small cabin the park had provided for her. She set up motion-activated cameras around her vehicle, and when she reviewed the footage the next morning, she discovered something disturbing. Throughout the night, figures had moved around her RV, shadowy forms that appeared on the infrared cameras, but were invisible to the naked eye. The cameras captured at least 5 distinct entities, ranging from child-sized to tall adult figures. Friday afternoon, as Emma was packing to leave a day early, she decided to make one last visit to the old cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. The cemetery contained hundreds of graves, many marked with simple wooden headstones that had weathered over time. As she was photographing a particularly poignant section containing the graves of several children who had died during a diphtheria outbreak, she noticed something unusual. Fresh flowers had been placed on several of the graves' wildflowers that were not native to the area and certainly not part of the park's maintenance. More disturbingly, small toys had appeared on the children's graves: a tin soldier, a porcelain doll, a wooden horse. Emma knew these items hadn't been there when she had visited the cemetery 2 days earlier, as she had photographed the same section. As Emma stood looking at the graves, she heard what sounded like a woman crying softly. The sound seemed to be coming from a large oak tree near the edge of the cemetery. When she approached, she saw that someone had carved names into the bark of the tree names that matched those on the children's graves nearby. The carvings appeared fresh, with wood shavings still on the ground beneath the tree. Emma reported these incidents to Park Ranger Mitchell before departing Bodie. In his official report, California State Parks Incident Report 18 BOD 087, Mitchell noted that he found unexplained items in the cemetery and unusual disturbances in the buildings Emma had mentioned, though he made no official determination about their cause. The report does note that the temperature in the general store was 15 degrees lower than the outside temperature, despite the building being closed up during a heat wave. What makes Emma's encounter particularly compelling is the photographic and video evidence she captured. The footage of items moving in the general store has been analyzed by multiple experts, with no evidence of tampering or special effects found. The infrared footage from around her RV shows clear figures moving with purpose, not like animals or natural phenomena. Perhaps most disturbing is the historical context of Bodie. The town had a reputation for violence during its heyday, with a murder rate reportedly averaging one per day. The cemetery where Emma found fresh flowers and toys contains the graves of many who died violently, as well as numerous children who succumbed to diseases that swept through the mining camp. Could the phenomena Emma witnessed be connected to these tragic deaths? Since Emma's visit, other photographers and visitors to Bodie have reported similar experiences. Park rangers have noted an increase in reports of strange sounds and movements, particularly in the buildings Emma documented. The Park Service has not officially acknowledged these occurrences, but has quietly increased monitoring of the historic buildings after hours. Emma Rodriguez never completed her book on Bodie. Instead, she published a limited edition volume containing her photographs, along with a detailed account of her experiences. The book, Arrested Decay: A Week in Bodie, has become a collector's item among paranormal researchers, though Emma herself has never publicly classified her experiences as supernatural. In interviews, Emma has maintained a scientific approach to what she witnessed, suggesting that perhaps some locations retain environmental imprints of events that occurred there, not necessarily ghosts in the traditional sense, but something more like emotional or psychic residue that becomes visible under certain conditions. She has returned to Bodie only once since that August in 2018, and found the town exactly as she had left it, frozen in time, waiting silently for the next visitor who might see beyond the arrested decay to what truly remains. In September of 2020, wildlife biologist Dr. Richard Harlow and his research assistant, Maya Patel, arrived in Garnett, Montana, to study how abandoned human settlements affect local ecosystems. Garnett, a former mining town that had been largely abandoned by the 1940s, now stood as a remarkably well-preserved ghost town, with over 30 buildings still standing. What they discovered during their 2-week study would challenge their scientific understanding of abandoned places. Dr. Harlow had chosen Garnett specifically because of its isolation and the fact that it had been abandoned relatively quickly, leaving behind a snapshot of early 20th century mining life. He and Maya planned to document wildlife populations in and around the town, comparing them to populations in similar areas without human structures. Their research was funded by a grant from the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The first week of their study proceeded normally. They set up motion-activated cameras throughout the town, established observation posts, and began collecting data on the animals that had made their homes in the abandoned buildings. They documented squirrels nesting in the hotel, birds building nests in the general store, and even a small family of foxes living under the floorboards of what had once been the schoolhouse. The atmosphere in Garnett was peaceful, with only the sounds of nature disturbing the silence of the abandoned town. The September weather was mild, with warm days and cool nights that created a thin layer of morning mist in the valleys surrounding the town. Dr. Harlow and Maya settled into a routine of checking cameras, collecting samples, and recording their observations in detailed field notes. The first anomaly occurred on the 8th day of their study. Maya was reviewing footage from one of the motion-activated cameras that had been placed inside what had been the town's saloon. The camera had been triggered at 2:17 a.m., though the timestamp showed no movement had been detected. When Maya reviewed the footage, she discovered why the camera had recorded what appeared to be a figure sitting at the bar, though it was barely visible and seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Dr. Harlow examined the footage and initially dismissed it as a technical glitch or perhaps light from the moon creating an optical illusion. However, when they checked the other cameras, they discovered similar anomalies. Cameras placed in various buildings throughout the town had all recorded what appeared to be human figures. though none were visible to the naked eye and none had triggered the motion sensors except for one camera that had malfunctioned. The following night, Dr. Harlow and Maya decided to conduct an all-night observation from a small hill overlooking the town. Using night vision binoculars and thermal imaging equipment, they planned to document animal activity in and around the buildings. What they witnessed instead would become the focus of their research for the remainder of their time in Garnet. At approximately 11:43 p.m., Maya noticed movement in what had been the town's hotel. Through her binoculars, she could see what appeared to be lights moving inside the building, though she knew there was no electricity connected to any of the structures in Garnet. The lights moved from room to room, following what seemed to be a logical pattern through the hotel's layout. Dr. Harlow trained his thermal imaging equipment on the hotel and discovered something even more unusual. The thermal cameras showed heat signatures consistent with human bodies moving through the building, at least 5 distinct figures of various sizes. When he switched to normal night vision, no figures were visible, yet the thermal signatures remained clear. As they watched, similar phenomena began to occur in other buildings throughout the town. Lights appeared in what had been the general store, the blacksmith shop, and several of the residential cabins. Thermal imaging equipment showed heat signatures moving through these buildings as well, though nothing was visible to the naked eye or through night vision binoculars. The most disturbing observation occurred at approximately 1:22 a.m. Dr. Harlow and Maya both witnessed what appeared to be a procession of figures moving down the main street of Garnet. These figures were visible only through thermal imaging. They appeared as distinct heat signatures in human form, walking purposefully through the town. The thermal camera showed approximately 15 figures of various sizes, including some that appeared to be children. What made this observation particularly compelling was that the figures moved with purpose and intelligence. They didn't drift randomly like heat anomalies might. Rather, they moved as if they were reenacting specific activities, entering buildings, pausing at certain locations, interacting with each other in ways that suggested conversation or other social behaviors. Dr. Harlow, a man of science with 20 years of field experience, was at a loss to explain what he was witnessing. The thermal imaging equipment was state-of-the-art and had been calibrated just days before. There were no environmental conditions that could create such specific and consistent heat signatures. The figures remained visible for approximately 45 minutes before gradually fading from view. The following day, Dr. Harlow and Maya examined the areas where the thermal figures had been most active. They discovered that the dust in several buildings had been disturbed, showing what appeared to be footprints and other signs of recent activity. In the hotel, what appeared to be fresh handprints were visible on the banister of the main staircase, though no one had entered the building since Dr. Baust. Harlow and Maya had set up their equipment a week earlier. Perhaps most disturbingly, in what had been the town's schoolhouse, they found that a small chalkboard had been wiped clean, and simple arithmetic problems had been written in what appeared to be chalk. The handwriting matched examples of children's schoolwork from the early 1900s that were displayed in the small visitor center near the entrance to Garnet. Dr. Harlow contacted his supervisor at the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to report these phenomena. In his official report, FWP 20-09447, he carefully documented his observations while maintaining a scientific perspective. The report notes unexplained thermal phenomena and inexplicable disturbances in several buildings, but makes no determination about their cause. The department's response was to send 2 additional researchers to assist Dr. Harlow and Maya, though they arrived after the most intense phenomena had subsided. The additional researchers did witness some thermal anomalies, though nothing as dramatic as what Dr. Harlow and Maya had observed. They did, however, confirm that the dust disturbances and other physical evidence were genuine and not easily explained. What makes Dr. Harlow and Maya's encounter particularly significant is their scientific background and methodical approach to documentation. Both were experienced field researchers with no interest in paranormal phenomena. Their equipment was professional grade and properly calibrated. Their detailed field notes and time-stamped recordings provide compelling evidence of something that defies conventional explanation. The historical context of Garnet adds another layer to this mystery. The town had been home to approximately 1,000 people at its peak in the late 1890s, with a diverse population that included miners, merchants, and their families. Unlike many mining towns, Garnet had been relatively peaceful, with only a few documented violent deaths. The town had gradually declined as the mines played out, with most residents leaving by the 1940s. Could the thermal phenomena witnessed by Dr. Harlow and Maya be related to the town's history? Perhaps some form of environmental imprint remains in places where intense human activity occurred, visible only through specific technological means. Or perhaps Garnet serves as some kind of way station for something that passes through, using the abandoned buildings as temporary shelter. Harlow and Maya completed their ecological study, though their findings about wildlife populations were overshadowed by their other observations. In their final report, they suggested that abandoned human settlements may create unique environmental conditions that merit further study, carefully avoiding any mention of what they had witnessed through their thermal imaging equipment. Both researchers have returned to Garnet only once since their initial study, accompanied by a team from a university that specializes in unexplained phenomena. During this follow-up visit, they documented similar thermal anomalies, though not as dramatic as those witnessed during their initial 2-week stay. The team has since published a paper in a scientific journal, carefully framing their findings as unusual thermal patterns in abandoned human settlements. Dr. Harlow has since retired from field research, citing health reasons, though colleagues note that he seemed fundamentally changed by his experiences in Garnet. Maya Patel continues her work as a wildlife biologist, but has focused on urban environments rather than remote wilderness areas. Both have declined most interview requests about their time in Garnet. Though in a rare interview, Dr. Harlow acknowledged that some places retain more than just physical structures when humans depart, and they retain patterns, activities, perhaps even consciousness in forms we don't yet understand. Today, Garnet remains one of the best-preserved ghost towns in Montana, visited by thousands of tourists each year. Most visitors see only abandoned buildings and learn about the town's history from interpretive signs. But occasionally, someone with thermal imaging equipment or other specialized technology might witness what Dr. Harlow and Maya observed, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but something else entirely. Something that continues its routines in the abandoned buildings, waiting for the day when new residents might arrive to give it purpose once again. In October of 2019, urban exploration photographer Jason Mitchell arrived in Thurmond, West Virginia, to document what was once one of the most prosperous railroad towns in the New River Gorge. Now a virtual ghost town with a population of fewer than 10 people, Thurmond stood as a testament to the rise and fall of the coal and railroad industries. What Jason captured during his 5-day visit would become far more than architectural documentation. Jason had been fascinated by abandoned places for over a decade, and Thurmond represented a unique opportunity to document a town that had transitioned from bustling center to near-abandoned community in just a few decades. He had arranged to stay in the restored Thurmond Depot, which now served as a visitor center and occasionally rented rooms to researchers and historians interested in the town's history. The first 2 days of Jason's visit proceeded normally. He photographed the abandoned commercial buildings along the main street, documenting the decay and gradual reclamation by nature. The weather was typical for West Virginia in October, cool mornings with mist rising from the New River, followed by crisp autumn afternoons with sunlight filtering through the changing leaves. The atmosphere was melancholic but peaceful, with only the sound of occasional trains passing on the still active railroad tracks disturbing the silence. The first anomaly occurred on the evening of the third day. Jason was reviewing photographs he had taken earlier that day of what had once been the town's bank. As he was zooming in on a detail of the building's facade, he noticed something unusual in one of the upper windows. A figure appeared to be standing there, looking down at the street where Jason had been standing when he took the photograph. At first, Jason assumed it was a reflection or some other photographic artifact. However, when he examined other photographs taken from different angles at approximately the same time, he discovered that the figure appeared in several images, always in the same position and always looking directly toward where Jason had been standing. The figure was indistinct but clearly human in form, wearing what appeared to be early 20th century clothing. The following morning, Jason returned to the bank building to investigate further. The building had been boarded up for years, with no way to enter without causing damage. As he was photographing the exterior, he heard what sounded like footsteps moving around inside the building, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to be pacing back and forth on the upper floor. Jason set up his camera to record continuously while he circled the building, looking for any signs of recent entry. All windows and doors were securely boarded, with no evidence of tampering. The sounds from inside continued for approximately 20 minutes before ceasing abruptly. When Jason reviewed his camera footage later, he discovered that his microphone had captured what sounded like muffled voices, speaking in what he identified as an Eastern European accent. That evening, as Jason was preparing dinner in the small kitchenette of the depot, he heard what sounded like a train approaching. This wasn't unusual. Several trains passed through Thurmond each day on the active CSX line. What was unusual was that this train seemed to stop at the abandoned station, though no trains had stopped at Thurmond for passenger service since the 1950s. Jason looked out the window and saw what appeared to be an old-fashioned steam train stopped at the platform. The engine and cars looked like something from the early 20th century, complete with dim gas lamps illuminating the platforms. Figures moved back and forth between the train and the station, what appeared to be passengers in period clothing, porters carrying luggage, and railroad workers in uniforms Jason had only seen in historical photographs. Jason grabbed his camera and began filming, though he noticed something strange as he watched through the lens. The train and its passengers were visible through the camera viewfinder, but appeared indistinct and almost transparent when viewed with the naked eye. As he continued to film, the train whistle blew a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the train slowly began to move away from the station, gradually fading from view. The following day, Jason mentioned these experiences to the park ranger who managed the visitor center. Ranger Sarah Williams listened patiently before explaining that Jason wasn't the first visitor to report unusual phenomena in Thurmond. She showed him a logbook where visitors had documented similar experiences over the years, sightings of figures in abandoned buildings, sounds of trains that weren't there, and even encounters with what appeared to be historical reenactors who vanished when approached. Ranger Williams shared that Thurmond had been a particularly busy railroad town in the early 1900s, with as many as 15 passenger trains stopping there each day. The town had been home to a diverse population of railroad workers, coal miners, and their families. Many had lived difficult lives in what was essentially a company town controlled by the railroad and mining interests. Perhaps most significantly, Ranger Williams showed Jason photographs of a train wreck that had occurred just outside Thurmond in 1910, killing 23 passengers and crew. The photographs showed a steam train similar to the one Jason had witnessed, suggesting that what he had seen might have been some kind of recurring echo of this tragic event. Jason's final encounter occurred on his last night in Thurmond. He was photographing the abandoned hotel, which had once been the most luxurious lodging between Charleston and Cincinnati. As he was setting up his equipment, he noticed that lights appeared to be on inside the building, though he knew there was no electricity connected to the structure. Through his camera lens, Jason could see figures moving inside the hotel, what appeared to be guests in formal evening wear, staff in uniforms, and even a band playing on a small stage in what had been the hotel's ballroom. The scene was visible only through his camera. When he lowered it to look directly at the hotel, the building appeared dark and abandoned. Jason continued filming for approximately 30 minutes, documenting what appeared to be a sophisticated social event from the early 20th century. The figures moved with purpose, interacting with each other in ways that suggested genuine conversation and activity. They didn't seem to notice Jason's presence, though occasionally one would glance toward the window where he was filming, as if sensing something just beyond their perception. The most disturbing moment occurred when one of the figures, a woman in a long blue dress, approached the window where Jason was filming. She looked directly toward his position, though her expression was difficult to discern through the camera lens. She raised one hand and placed it against the glass, as if trying to touch something just beyond her reach. Then she turned and walked back into the crowd, gradually fading from view. Jason packed up his equipment and returned to the depot, where he spent a restless night. He heard what sounded like music and laughter coming from the direction of the hotel until approximately 2 a.m., though when he looked out the window, the building appeared dark and silent. The following morning, Jason met with Ranger Williams one final time before leaving Thurmond. She listened to his account and examined his photographs and video footage. In her official report, National Park Service Incident Report 19-THU-073, she noted that Jason had documented unexplained visual phenomena, but made no determination about their cause. What makes Jason's encounter particularly compelling is the photographic and video evidence he captured. The footage of the train and the hotel party has been analyzed by multiple experts, with no evidence of tampering or special effects found. The audio recordings of what sounds like period-appropriate music and conversation have been enhanced and analyzed, with linguists identifying dialects and speech patterns consistent with early 20th century West Virginia. The historical context of Thurmond adds another layer to this mystery. The town had been home to thousands of people during its peak years, with a reputation for both prosperity and hardship. The railroad that had been the town's lifeblood had also been the source of tragedy, as evidenced by the 1910 train wreck. The hotel where Jason witnessed the party had been the scene of countless social events, celebrations, and perhaps some sorrows as well. Since Jason's visit, other photographers and visitors to Thurmond have reported similar experiences. The National Park Service has not officially acknowledged these occurrences, but has quietly added information about unusual phenomena to the materials provided to researchers staying overnight in the depot. Jason Mitchell has since published a book of his Thurmond photographs, titled Echoes of the New River, which includes his account of what he witnessed. The book has become popular among both photography enthusiasts and paranormal researchers, though Jason himself has maintained a careful balance between documentation and speculation about what he experienced. In interviews, Jason has suggested that perhaps some locations retain imprints of significant events that become visible under certain conditions. He has noted that the phenomena he witnessed in Thurmond seemed to be connected to periods of intense human activity. The bustling railroad operations, the social gatherings at the hotel, the tragic train wreck, Perhaps these events left behind some kind of residue that occasionally becomes visible to those with the right equipment or simply the right sensitivity to such phenomena. Today, Thurmond remains one of the most authentic ghost towns in America, with most of its original buildings still standing. Most visitors see only abandoned structures and learn about the town's history from interpretive displays. But occasionally, someone with a camera or simply a quiet, observant nature might witness what Jason experienced, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of what once was, replaying endlessly in the abandoned buildings and along the railroad tracks that defined the town's existence. In June of 2021, historical researcher Dr. Margaret Wilson and her graduate assistant, Daniel Foster, arrived in St. Elmo, Colorado, to study the social dynamics of mining communities in the late 19th century. St. Elmo, a former gold and silver mining town that had been largely abandoned by the 1920s, now stood as one of Colorado's best-preserved ghost towns, with many original buildings still containing personal items left behind by former residents. What they discovered during their month-long stay would challenge their understanding of abandoned places and what might remain in them. Dr. Wilson had chosen St. Elmo for her research because of its remarkably complete historical record, including extensive personal correspondence, business records, and photographs that provided insight into daily life in a remote mining community. She and Daniel planned to cross-reference these historical documents with the physical remains of the town, creating a detailed picture of how the community had functioned during its peak years in the 1880s and 1890s. The first week of their research proceeded normally. They established a workspace in what had been the town's general store, now maintained as a small museum by the seasonal caretakers. They spent their days photographing buildings, measuring rooms, and documenting the arrangement of spaces, while their evenings were spent analyzing historical documents and planning the next day's work. The atmosphere in St. Elmo was peaceful, with only the sounds of nature disturbing the silence of the abandoned town. The June weather was mild, with warm days and cool nights that created a perfect environment for fieldwork. Dr. Wilson and Daniel settled into a routine of careful documentation and analysis, making steady progress on their research project. The first anomaly occurred on the 9th day of their stay. Daniel was photographing the interior of what had been the family home of the Stark family, who had been among the last residents to leave St. Elmo. As he was focusing on a detail of the kitchen, he heard what sounded like a woman humming a tune. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from what appeared to be an empty bedroom down the hall. Daniel called Dr. Wilson, and together they investigated the sound. The humming continued for approximately 5 minutes before ceasing abruptly. They found no explanation for the sound, no open windows or doors that could allow outside noise to enter, no electronic devices that could be producing the sound, and no signs of recent human activity in the bedroom. The following day, as Dr. Wilson was examining a collection of personal letters written by Annabelle Stark, the family's matriarch, she discovered something unusual. One of the letters, written in 1898, mentioned a specific lullaby that Annabelle used to sing to her children. When Dr. Wilson hummed the tune mentioned in the letter, Daniel recognized it immediately as the melody they had heard the previous day. This coincidence was intriguing, but not necessarily supernatural. Perhaps Daniel had heard the tune somewhere before, and his memory had been triggered by the letter. However, what happened later that day suggested something more unusual was occurring. As Dr. Wilson and Daniel were working in the general store, they heard what sounded like footsteps approaching on the wooden porch. The steps were heavy and deliberate, accompanied by what sounded like the jingle of spurs, a sound that would have been common in St. Elmo's mining days, but certainly not today. The footsteps stopped at the door, though no one entered when Dr. Wilson called out. Daniel looked through the window, but saw no one on the porch. However, when he examined the floorboards just inside the door, he discovered fresh tracks in the dust boot prints that hadn't been there when they had arrived that morning, and that didn't match either of their footwear. The prints led to a display case containing mining equipment before disappearing. The most significant encounter occurred 3 days later. Dr. Wilson was alone in what had been the town's hotel, examining the guest register and cross-referencing names with other historical documents. As she was working, she became aware of what sounded like a poker game in progress in the adjacent saloon. The sounds were distinct cards being shuffled, chips clinking, low voices speaking in what she identified as period-appropriate slang and dialects. Dr. Wilson approached the doorway to the saloon and peered inside. The room appeared empty. Bathed in the afternoon light, streaming through the dusty windows. However, the sounds continued now, including what sounded like laughter, the clinking of glasses, and even a piano playing a tune that would have been popular in the 1890s. What happened next was documented by Dr. Wilson in her field notes, which she maintained with scientific precision despite the unusual circumstances. As she stood listening to the sounds from the saloon, she noticed that dust particles in the air began to move, in unusual patterns, swirling and dancing, as if disturbed by movement in the room. Small objects on tables shifted position slightly, and a poker chip that had been lying on the floor slid several feet as if kicked. Dr. Wilson set up her audio recording equipment and captured approximately 20 minutes of what sounded like a lively poker game, complete with distinct voices, laughter, and even arguments over rules. When she later had the recording analyzed by audio experts, they confirmed that the sounds were genuine and not the result of manipulation or external interference. Even more intriguing, linguists identified the speech patterns and vocabulary as consistent with Colorado mining towns in the 1890s. Daniel arrived shortly after the sounds ceased, and together they examined the saloon. They discovered that several items had been moved from their earlier positions, chairs arranged around a table as if for a game, playing cards scattered as if recently used, and what appeared to be fresh spill marks on the wooden bar as if drinks had recently been placed there. The following day, Dr. Wilson contacted the Colorado Historical Society, which managed the St. Elmo Historic Site, to report these phenomena. The site director, Robert Chen, visited St. Elmo that afternoon and examined the evidence. In his official report, CHS 2106-182, Chen noted unexplained audio phenomena and inexplicable disturbances in several buildings, but made no official determination about their cause. What makes Dr. Wilson and Daniel's encounter particularly compelling is their scientific background and methodical approach to documentation. Both were experienced researchers with no particular interest in paranormal phenomena. Their audio recordings and detailed field notes provide compelling evidence of something that defies conventional explanation. The historical context of St. Elmo adds another layer to this mystery. The town had been home to approximately 2,000 people at its peak in the 1890s, with a diverse population that included miners, merchants, and their families. The town had experienced both prosperity and hardship, with numerous documented conflicts, accidents, and tragedies. Perhaps most significantly, the Stark family, whose home Dr. Wilson and Daniel had investigated first, had been among the last residents to leave St. Elmo, with Annabelle Stark reportedly refusing to abandon her home until her death in 1960. Could the phenomena witnessed by Dr. Wilson and Daniel be related to the town's history? Perhaps some form of environmental imprint remains in places where intense human activity occurred, particularly emotional or significant events. The humming in the Stark home, the boot prints in the general store, the poker game in the saloon all seem to be echoes of specific activities that had occurred in these locations during St. Elmo's heyday. Dr. Wilson and Daniel completed their research project. Though their findings about social dynamics in mining communities were overshadowed by their other observations. In their final report, they suggested that abandoned settlements may retain acoustic and environmental imprints of previous human activity, carefully avoiding any mention of what they had witnessed. Both researchers have returned to St. Elmo only once since their initial study, accompanied by a team of specialists in unexplained phenomena. During this follow-up visit, they documented similar audio anomalies, though not as dramatic as those witnessed during their initial month-long stay. The team has since published a paper in a historical journal, carefully framing their findings as unusual acoustic patterns in preserved historical environments. Dr. Wilson has since become a leading voice in the study of what she terms historical environmental imprints, phenomena that suggest some locations retain more than just physical structures when humans depart. Daniel Foster has continued his work as a historical researcher, but has focused specifically on sites with reported unusual phenomena, developing methodologies for documenting such occurrences with scientific rigor. Today, St. Elmo remains one of Colorado's most popular ghost towns, visited by thousands of tourists each year. Most see only abandoned buildings and learn about the town's history from interpretive displays. But occasionally, someone with a quiet, observant nature might witness what Dr. Wilson and Daniel experienced, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of what once was, replaying endlessly in the abandoned buildings and along the dusty streets that once bustled with life. In July of 2022, geologist Dr. Samuel Chen and his research team arrived in Rhyolite, Nevada, to study how natural processes affect abandoned human structures in desert environments. Rhyolite, a former gold mining town that had boomed and busted within a decade in the early 20th century, now stood as one of Nevada's most extensive ghost towns, with numerous buildings in various states of decay. What they discovered during their 3-week study would challenge their scientific understanding of abandoned places. Dr. Barastor Chen had chosen Rhyolite specifically because of its location in the harsh desert environment of the Amargosa Desert, where extreme temperatures and minimal precipitation created unique conditions for the study of structural decay. His team, consisting of graduate students Emily Rodriguez, Marcus Thompson, and Dr. Lisa Park, a specialist in desert ecology, planned to document how the desert environment was affecting the remaining buildings and infrastructure of the town. The first week of their study proceeded normally. They set up monitoring equipment to measure temperature fluctuations, wind patterns, and other environmental factors that might affect the remaining structures. They photographed and measured cracks, erosion patterns, and other signs of decay, establishing a baseline for their research. The atmosphere was oppressive in the July heat, with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropping to the 70s at night. The first anomaly occurred on the 8th day of their study. Emily was photographing the facade of what had been the town's bank, one of the most elaborate buildings in Rhyolite. As she was reviewing her photographs, she noticed something unusual in several images, taken at approximately 2:30 p.m. A figure appeared to be standing in one of the broken windows, though Emily knew no one had been near the building at that time. The figure was indistinct, but clearly human in form, wearing what appeared to be early 20th century clothing, a dark suit and hat that would have been typical attire for a businessman during Rhyolite's boom years. The figure appeared in multiple photographs, taken from different angles, always in the same position and always looking directly toward Emily's position. Dr. Chen examined the photographs and initially dismissed them as optical illusions or perhaps tricks of light created by the harsh desert sun. However, when the team reviewed other photographs taken around the same time, they discovered similar anomalies in images of other buildings throughout the town, figures appearing in windows and doorways. always in period clothing and always looking directly toward where the photographs had been taken. The following day, as the team was setting up additional monitoring equipment near what had been the town's train depot, Marcus noticed something unusual. The equipment was registering temperature fluctuations that didn't correspond to the environmental conditions they had been documenting. Specifically, thermal sensors were detecting cold spots in specific locations areas where the temperature was 20 to 30 degrees lower than the surrounding desert air. Dr. Chen examined the sensor readings and confirmed that they were accurate. The cold spots were localized and stationary, appearing in what seemed to be random locations throughout the town. When team members entered these cold spots, they reported feeling sudden chills and, in some cases, the sensation of being watched. The most significant encounter occurred 3 days later. Dr. Park was conducting a botanical survey in what had been the town's residential area, documenting how desert plants were colonizing the spaces where houses once stood. As she was examining a particularly resilient patch of desert grass, she heard what sounded like children's laughter. The sound was distinct and clear, multiple voices engaged in what seemed to be a game. Dr. Park looked around but saw no one. The team was the only group for miles in any direction. The laughter continued for several minutes before ceasing abruptly. When Dr. Park examined the area where the sound seemed to have originated, she discovered something unusual. The desert grass in a small circular area was arranged in what appeared to be a pattern almost like a small nest or play area. Within this circle were small objects that hadn't been there when Dr. Park had surveyed the area the previous day: a rusted tin toy soldier, a piece of what appeared to be a porcelain doll, and several smooth stones arranged in a semicircle. That evening, as the team was reviewing their findings in their temporary research station, they experienced something even more unusual. The electricity powering their equipment began to fluctuate, though they were using a generator that had been functioning perfectly. At the same time, they heard what sounded like music playing a tinny, old-fashioned melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Chen, a pragmatic scientist with 20 years of field experience, was at a loss to explain these phenomena. The team documented everything meticulously, recording audio of the music and noting the exact times and locations of the temperature anomalies and other occurrences. They also set up additional cameras to monitor the areas where figures had been photographed. The following night, these cameras captured something extraordinary. At approximately 1:17 a.m., motion sensors were triggered near what had been the town's schoolhouse. The cameras recorded what appeared to be multiple figures moving around the building, small figures that seemed to be children, running and playing in the moonlight. The figures were indistinct and almost transparent, but definitely visible on the recording. What made this footage particularly compelling was that the figures moved with purpose and intelligence. They didn't drift randomly like heat anomalies might. Rather, they played specific games what appeared to be tag, hide and seek, and ring around the rosy. The footage showed approximately 8 figures of various sizes, all appearing to be children. The team reviewed the footage multiple times, checking for any signs of manipulation or equipment malfunction. The cameras had been functioning perfectly, and the footage showed no evidence of tampering. The figures remained visible for approximately 25 minutes before gradually fading from view as the moon passed behind a cloud. The following day, Dr. Chen contacted his supervisor at the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology to report these phenomena. In his official report, NBMG 220731, he carefully documented his team's observations while maintaining a scientific perspective. The report notes unexplained thermal phenomena and inexplicable disturbances throughout the town, but makes no determination about their cause. The Bureau's response was to send 2 additional researchers to assist Dr. Chen's team, though they arrived after the most intense phenomena had subsided. The additional researchers did witness some temperature anomalies and captured what appeared to be fleeting images on camera, though nothing as dramatic as what Dr. Chen's team had observed. They did, however, confirm that the physical evidence, the cold spots, the arranged objects, the other unexplained occurrences were genuine and not easily explained. What makes Dr. Chen's team's encounter particularly significant is their scientific background and methodical approach to documentation. All were experienced field researchers with no interest in paranormal phenomena. Their equipment was professional grade and properly calibrated. Their detailed field notes and time-stamped recordings provide compelling evidence of something that defies conventional explanation. The historical context of rhyolite adds another layer to this mystery. The town had experienced an incredibly rapid boom and bust cycle, growing from nothing to a population of approximately 5,000 in just a few years, then being almost completely abandoned within a decade after the mine closed. The town had been home to families with children, businesses, schools, and all the elements of a typical community, albeit one that existed in extreme conditions. Could the phenomena witnessed by Dr. Chen's team be related to the town's unique history? Perhaps the rapid rise and fall of rhyolite created some kind of environmental imprint that remains particularly strong due to the extreme desert conditions. The figures in the bank windows, the children playing near the schoolhouse, the cold spots in specific locations all seem to be echoes of specific activities that had occurred in these locations during rhyolite's brief but intense existence. Dr. Chen and his team completed their geological study, though their findings about structural decay were overshadowed by their other observations. In their final report, they suggested that desert environments may preserve unusual environmental phenomena in abandoned human settlements, carefully avoiding any mention of what they had witnessed. All members of the team have since returned to rhyolite only once, accompanied by a team from a university that specializes in unexplained phenomena. During this follow-up visit, they documented similar anomalies, though not as dramatic as those witnessed during their initial 3-week stay. The team has since published a paper in a scientific journal, carefully framing their findings as unusual environmental patterns in abandoned desert settlements. Dr. Chen has since shifted his research focus to what he terms environmental memory, the concept that locations might retain imprints of past events or activities under certain conditions. His work has gained some acceptance in mainstream scientific circles, though most colleagues remain skeptical about his conclusions based on the rhyolite study. Today, rhyolite remains one of Nevada's most extensive ghost towns, visited by thousands of tourists each year. Most see only abandoned buildings and learn about the town's history from interpretive displays. But occasionally, someone with a camera or simply a quiet, observant nature might witness what Dr. Chen's team experienced, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of what once was, replaying endlessly in the abandoned buildings and along the dusty streets that once bustled with life during one of Nevada's most dramatic boom and bust cycles. In August of 2020, environmental scientist Dr. Rebecca Taylor and her research assistant, Michael Harris, arrived in Kennecott, Alaska, to study how Arctic environments affect the preservation of abandoned industrial sites. Kennecott, a former copper mining town that had been abandoned in the 1930s, now stood as a remarkably well-preserved example of early 20th century industrial architecture in a remote wilderness setting. What they discovered during their 2-week study would challenge their understanding of abandoned places and what might remain in them. Dr. Taylor had chosen Kennecott specifically because of its unique combination of industrial architecture and extreme Arctic environment. The town, located in the heart of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, contained numerous buildings in various states of preservation. From the iconic Red Mill building that dominated the landscape to smaller residential structures that had been largely reclaimed by nature, she and Michael planned to document how the extreme cold, snow, and isolation had affected the remaining structures. The first week of their study proceeded normally. They set up monitoring equipment to measure temperature fluctuations, snow accumulation patterns, and other environmental factors that might affect the remaining buildings. They photographed and measured structural integrity, decay patterns, and other signs of the passage of time in the harsh Arctic environment. The atmosphere was surreal in the August light, with nearly 20 hours of daylight each day. The town seemed to exist in a perpetual twilight that added to its otherworldly quality. The first anomaly occurred on the 6th day of their study. Michael was photographing the interior of what had been the hospital building, one of the best preserved structures in Kennecott. As he was reviewing his photographs, he noticed something unusual in several images taken in what had been the operating room. A figure appeared to be standing near the operating table, though Michael knew no one had been in the building at that time. The figure was indistinct but clearly human in form, wearing what appeared to be early 20th century medical attire, a white coat and mask that would have been typical for a surgeon during Kennecott's operational years. The figure appeared in multiple photographs taken from different angles, always in the same position and always appearing to be focused on the operating table. Dr. Taylor examined the photographs and initially dismissed them as optical illusions or perhaps tricks of light created by the unusual Arctic daylight. However, when they reviewed other photographs taken around the same time, they discovered similar anomalies in images of other buildings throughout the town, figures appearing in various locations, always in period-appropriate attire, and always appearing to be engaged in work-related activities. The following day, as Dr. Taylor was conducting an environmental assessment in what had been the mill building, she noticed something unusual. The building, which had been abandoned for over 80 years, seemed to contain areas where the dust and decay patterns didn't match the expected progression. Specifically, in certain areas, the dust appeared to have been recently disturbed, as if someone had been walking through the building. Dr. Taylor examined these areas more closely and discovered what appeared to be fresh footprints in the dust prints that didn't match either her or Michael's footwear, and that seemed to appear in areas that would have been part of the mill's operational flow during its active years. The prints led through various sections of the building in what appeared to be a logical pattern, as if someone were following a specific work routine. The most significant encounter occurred 4 days later. Dr. Taylor and Michael were conducting a late-night observation of the town from a small hill overlooking the site. With the extended daylight hours of the Alaskan summer, they could see the entire town clearly in the soft twilight that never fully gave way to darkness. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Michael noticed lights appearing in what had been the manager's house, one of the larger residential buildings in Kennecott. The lights were dim and flickered like oil lamps or early electric lighting, not like the modern LED headlamps they were using. As they watched through binoculars, they could see figures moving inside the house, what appeared to be people in period clothing going about their evening routines. What made this observation particularly compelling was that the phenomena were visible both through binoculars and to the naked eye. The figures moved with purpose and intelligence, setting a table, reading by lamplight, even what appeared to be children playing on the floor. The scene was like watching a silent movie from the early 20th century, except that it was happening in real time in a building that had been abandoned for over 80 years. Dr. Taylor and Michael continued to observe for approximately 45 minutes, documenting what they witnessed with cameras and detailed field notes. The figures remained visible throughout this time, engaged in what appeared to be normal evening activities. Eventually, the lights in the house gradually dimmed, as if being turned off one by one, and the figures faded from view. The following day, Dr. Taylor and Michael examined the manager's house. The building had been secured to prevent unauthorized entry, with no signs of recent tampering. However, when they looked through the windows, they discovered that some items inside had been moved from their documented positions, a chair pulled up to a table, a book left open as if recently read, and what appeared to be fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. That evening, as they were reviewing their findings in their temporary research station, they experienced something even more unusual. They heard what sounded like machinery operating from the direction of the mill building, the distinct hum and clanking of what appeared to be industrial equipment. The sound was distant but clear, and when they investigated with directional microphones, they confirmed that it was coming from inside the abandoned mill. Dr. Taylor, a pragmatic scientist with 15 years of field experience in extreme environments, was at a loss to explain these phenomena. The team documented everything meticulously, recording audio of the machinery sounds and noting the exact times and locations of the visual anomalies and other occurrences. They also set up additional cameras to monitor the areas where figures had been observed. The following night, these cameras captured something extraordinary. At approximately 12:45 a.m., motion sensors were triggered near what had been the power plant. The cameras recorded what appeared to be multiple figures moving around the building workers in what seemed to be period-appropriate work attire, performing what appeared to be maintenance tasks on the equipment. The figures were indistinct and almost transparent, but definitely visible on the recording. What made this footage particularly compelling was that the figures moved with purpose and knowledge, operating specific equipment in what appeared to be correct sequences, moving through the building in patterns that suggested familiarity with the layout and machinery. The footage showed approximately 6 figures of various sizes, all appearing to be engaged in work activities. The team reviewed the footage multiple times, checking for any signs of manipulation or equipment malfunction. The cameras had been functioning perfectly, and the footage showed no evidence of tampering. The figures remained visible for approximately 30 minutes before gradually fading from view as the Alaskan twilight began to brighten toward morning. The following day, Dr. Taylor contacted her supervisor at the National Park Service to report these phenomena. In her official report, NPS 20-08-227, she carefully documented her team's observations while maintaining a scientific perspective. The report notes unexplained visual and auditory phenomena and inexplicable disturbances throughout the town, but makes no determination about their cause. The Park Service's response was to send 2 additional researchers to assist Dr. Taylor's team, though they arrived after the most intense phenomena had subsided. The additional researchers did witness some visual anomalies and captured what appeared to be fleeting images on camera, though nothing as dramatic as what Dr. Taylor's team had observed. They did, however, confirm that the physical evidence, the disturbed dust patterns, the moved objects, the other unexplained occurrences were genuine and not easily explained. What makes Dr. Taylor's team's encounter particularly significant is their scientific background and methodical approach to documentation. Both were experienced field researchers with no interest in paranormal phenomena. Their equipment was professional grade and properly calibrated for the extreme Arctic environment. Their detailed field notes and time-stamped recordings provide compelling evidence of something that defies conventional explanation. The historical context of Kennecott adds another layer to this mystery. The town had been home to approximately 500 people during its operational years, with a highly structured social hierarchy and work routine that dominated every aspect of daily life. The town had been abandoned suddenly when the copper market collapsed and the mine closed in 1938, with residents leaving behind most of their possessions as they departed. Could the phenomena witnessed by Dr. Taylor's team be related to the town's unique history? Perhaps the sudden abandonment and extreme Arctic conditions created some kind of environmental imprint that remains particularly strong due to the isolation and preservation of the site. The surgeon in the hospital, the workers in the mill, the family in the manager's house, all seem to be echoes of specific activities that had occurred in these locations during Kennecott's operational years. Dr. Taylor and Michael completed their environmental study, though their findings about structural preservation were overshadowed by their other observations. In their final report, they suggested that Arctic environments may preserve unusual environmental phenomena in abandoned industrial sites, carefully avoiding any mention of what they had witnessed. Both researchers have returned to Kennecott only once since their initial study, accompanied by a team of specialists in unexplained phenomena. During this follow-up visit, they documented similar anomalies, though not as dramatic as those witnessed during their initial 2-week stay. The team has since published a paper in a scientific journal, carefully framing their findings as unusual environmental patterns in abandoned Arctic settlements. Dr. Taylor has since shifted her research focus to what she terms industrial memory, the concept that locations with intense industrial activity might retain imprints of those activities under certain environmental conditions. Her work has gained some acceptance in mainstream scientific circles, though most colleagues remain skeptical about her conclusions based on the Kennecott study. Today, Kennecott remains one of Alaska's most significant historic sites, visited by thousands of tourists each year. Most see only abandoned buildings and learn about the town's history from interpretive displays. But occasionally, someone with a camera or simply a quiet, observant nature might witness what Dr. Taylor's team experienced. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of what once was. Replaying endlessly in the abandoned buildings and along the dirt paths that once bustled with workers during one of Alaska's most significant industrial operations. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, dotted with the remnants of communities that once thrived and now stand abandoned. These ghost towns serve as monuments to dreams that flourished and faded, to industries that rose and fell, to lives that were lived with intensity in places that now seem empty and forgotten. The 8 accounts we've explored tonight span the breadth of America, from the mountains of Appalachia to the deserts of Nevada, from the Alaskan wilderness to the small towns of the Midwest. Each tells a similar story. Curious visitors or researchers entering abandoned communities expecting only decay and silence, but instead encountering phenomena that suggest these places are not as empty as they appear. What remains in these abandoned towns? The witnesses we've heard from documentary filmmakers, historians, scientists, photographers have documented phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Figures appear in photographs and on thermal imaging equipment. Sounds of activity echo through empty buildings. Objects move and arrange themselves in patterns that suggest purpose rather than random decay. Perhaps some locations retain more than just physical structures when humans depart. Perhaps the intense human activity that characterized these towns during their operational years, the mining, the commerce, the daily routines, the celebrations and tragedies left behind some kind of residue that occasionally becomes visible to those with the right equipment or simply the right sensitivity to such phenomena. The abandoned towns we've explored tonight were each unique in their history and character. Yet the phenomena witnessed in them share common elements. Figures engaged in activities that would have been typical during the town's operational years, sounds of machinery or daily life. Objects moved or arranged in ways that suggest continuation of routines that ended decades ago. These aren't tales of haunted houses or restless spirits in the traditional sense. Rather, they suggest that entire communities might somehow continue their existence in forms we don't yet understand. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is the credibility of the witnesses. These are not paranormal investigators seeking thrills, but professional scientists, historians, photographers who approached these locations with methodical rigor and documented their experiences with precision. Their equipment was professional grade and properly calibrated. Their detailed notes and time-stamped recordings provide compelling evidence of something that defies conventional explanation. The historical context of each town adds another layer to these mysteries. Centralia, with its underground coal fire that continues to burn beneath abandoned streets. Cahaba, with its layers of tragedy from native displacement to Civil War prison camp. Bodie, with its reputation for violence during its mining heyday. Garnet, with its remarkably preserved buildings from the early 20th century. Thurmond, with its railroad history and tragic train wreck. St. Elmo, with its well-documented social history. Erriolite, with its dramatic boom and bust cycle. Kennecott, with its industrial architecture preserved by the Arctic environment. Each town witnessed intense human activity followed by sudden or gradual abandonment. Perhaps this combination, intense activity followed by sudden emptiness, creates conditions that allow some kind of environmental imprint to remain visible under certain circumstances. Perhaps these abandoned towns serve as vessels for phenomena that we don't yet understand, but that seem connected to the human experiences that unfolded within their boundaries. The phenomena witnessed in these abandoned towns raise profound questions about the nature of memory, place, and consciousness. Do locations retain imprints of events that occurred within them? Can intense human activity somehow alter the environment in ways that persist long after the humans have departed? These questions touch on the boundaries between science and mystery, between what we can measure and what we can only observe. What we do know is that these abandoned towns continue to draw visitors, historians, photographers, tourists, and those simply curious about places where humans once thrived and now do not. Most visitors see only decay and learn about history from interpretive displays. But occasionally, someone with a camera or simply a quiet, observant nature might witness what our witnesses have experienced, echoes of what once was, replaying endlessly in the abandoned buildings and along the dusty streets. Perhaps these phenomena serve as reminders that the places we abandon are not truly empty. Perhaps they continue their existence in forms we don't yet understand, waiting for the day when humans might return to give them purpose once again. Or perhaps they simply are what they are, mysteries that exist at the boundaries of our knowledge, inviting us to question what we think we know about the nature of place and memory. The abandoned towns of America stand as silent witnesses to the transience of human endeavor. They remind us that even our most permanent-seeming creations eventually yield to time and nature. Yet perhaps something remains, not spirits in the traditional sense, but something more subtle, more complex, something that suggests our connection to place might be deeper and more mysterious than we currently understand. As we conclude tonight's journey through these abandoned communities, we're left with more questions than answers. What exactly remains in these places? Why do some abandoned locations seem to retain echoes of their past while others simply decay? Are these phenomena somehow connected to the specific histories of these towns? Or do they represent something more universal about abandoned human settlements? These questions may never be fully answered. The abandoned towns of America will continue their slow decay, gradually yielding to nature's reclamation. But perhaps as they crumble, they'll occasionally offer glimpses of what once was echoes of lives lived, work performed, communities that thrived and then faded. Perhaps these glimpses serve as reminders that even in abandonment there is presence, that even in silence there are stories waiting to be heard. If you or someone you know has a true story to share about experiences in abandoned towns or other unexplained phenomena, Leave it in the comments below. Our understanding of these mysteries grows with each account that is shared and documented. Thank you for watching Snowbound Screams. Until next time, stay safe out there.